What is it all about? What makes AI successful? What is that secret sauce according to you?
I wish I knew, right? I wish I knew the secret sauce. No, let me put my thoughts out there. Firstly,
Hello and welcome to the second episode of The Data Shift. I'm your host, Rajesh Indurthi, CTO of Charter Global, co-founder and CIO of Orcaworks. In this episode of The Data Shift, we are going to dive into how Agentic AI is driving transformation across enterprises. We here at Orcaworks believe that Agentic AI drives ROI into these enterprises. And to talk more about this, today we have our guest, Abhinav Somaraju. Abhinav, it's been a pleasure working with Abhinav, and I've been working with him for over 8 months. And he's a true entrepreneur and innovator at heart. He has been successfully running a few startups out of Melbourne and has held R&D positions at Cisco. Abhinav, welcome to the show.
thank you so much.
Let me quickly, for the benefit of the audience, explain the format of the show itself. The podcast is divided into 3 sections. We're going to start off with what we call as our warm-up questions. It's going to warm up into the conversation as to how Agentic AI is really playing into enterprises. We're going to focus this episode more on how it's playing into architecture, engineering, and construction vertical. And then we're going to move on to what we call as our strategy round. We're going to focus more on strategy for C-level leadership, as to how what you can take home as to what AI agentic offerings are contributing towards that. And then we're going to move to what we call as a pro section. We'll dive a little deep into the nuances of agentic AI, how does it work, and good stuff like that. The final round is my most favorite one. I'm going to have some fun shooting away some rapid questions to Abhinav. With that said, Abhinav, are you ready to dive in to this podcast? Awesome, fantastic. So let me start with this question that I hear very often all around. What is the difference between an agentic AI and just your co-pilots of the world, your chat GPTs of the world? What's the distinction? What's really driving the word agentic AI?
So firstly, I think everybody thinks of agents slightly differently, I must say, or at least how I think of it. I mean, generative AI or ChatGPT type solutions, right? So you ask it a question, it uses its knowledge of the world in some ways and answers the question that you ask it. But in an enterprise context, you have a lot of information that needs to be used to be for a user. So for example, let's look at the construction industry because we're thinking about construction, right? So when a user wants to understand how to respond to a bid or request for proposals, agent that is working with the user needs to understand your current situation, maybe needs to construct a solution and then sort of give an answer to the user that is useful for them. And you need a bunch of systems to come together above and beyond what ChatGPT can do for you. And that's essentially what an agent does, right? It actually listens to the environment, then uses a generative part like a ChatGPT solution, then produces an outcome that the user can use in an enterprise context. So that's how I think of how you would use an agent versus just say a ChatGPT-like solution.
That is interesting. To add a little bit more to that, when I first walked into Charter Global as their CTO, I was, I'm just drawing a little bit of analogy here. My founder came in and said, can't we make each of the departments smarter? And can we somehow use AI to make it smarter? And the first thing was, let's introduce tools to them, right? Copilot and whatnot. And quickly I realized that ChatGPT, Copilot, whatnot are just giving you the content. I think just like how you rightly said, it's really the agentic workflows which is driving the ROI, and that's what agentic AI gives. And I realized that as I was actually rolling these workflows into different departments, I started with sales. Right. And then I realized that, okay, all that it gives is content, and you still have to do a lot of work on top of it. So thanks for drawing that clarity into that piece of conversation. Now, because in this podcast, we are actually focusing on more on architecture, engineering, and construction. My second question is going to be about, these verticals, these industries already have an in-house, let's say, softwares like, Procore, softwares of those natures. Now, How do you see, we can talk specifically about Orcaworks, how do you see Orcaworks actually adding value to existing proven in-home software offerings? Where do you see Orcaworks really playing?
Yeah, I mean, like a very good question, right? I think the whole generative AI agentic play is fundamentally going to change everything that we're going to do, right? That's clear, and I think we are going in that direction. But obviously, in an enterprise context, there is so much, let's say, organizational behavioral patterns that we are used to, right? So you know that if you want to respond to a bid, then this is the place where you go and manage the bid. If you want to do project management, this is another piece of software that you use today. So in some ways, that is going to take a very, very long time before we actually want to even think of touching those systems. So the idea would be they are still your, say, systems of record. That's where everything happens. But some of the repetitive manual work that your users do, your employees do, in and around those systems is really where we first think that we should introduce agents, right? And Orcaworks is somehow built into integrating with the existing systems. It's not to replace it, but it is to replace the tedious, the manual jobs that your employees would do, which are repetitive, which are not necessarily adding value by themselves, but are crucial in terms of your processes. So the idea is, how do we augment existing solutions as opposed to replace them? Right? I think that's how we think about it.
That is very interesting. And we speak about this all the time at Orcaworks. And I've seen this throughout my enterprise career as well. It's not always the rip and replace which works. It's really how you smartly augment on top of what you already have. I think that's the thought process that you're actually elaborating on. That's very interesting. Now, and you touched on something even more interesting in these verticals, right? The whole aspect of bidding system and how, even thinking about these industries, there's a common problem statement per se, which is between your architecture, engineering, and construction. This bidding wars or bidding problem is always an underlying theme, right? I know you're a fantastic technologist at heart. If you can put a little bit of your business hat on and chat up a little bit about how big is this bidding problem? How do you see an agentic AI solution bringing value to a problem statement like that?
Yeah, I think good question, right? I mean, I'm not necessarily, obviously, as you put it, an expert when it comes to understanding the specific workflows and processes that happen in the construction industry, for example, right? I think from a technology point of view, you can see solutions. From a business point of view, we want to understand what the customer problem is, right? And some of the research, the preliminary research that we did in terms of bringing in revenue into companies, there are certain companies which are really, really driven by understanding how well you can respond to bids, respond to requested proposals. And that's really the driving factor when it comes to your entire pipeline and your entire revenue pipeline. And the idea is that, are there repetitive tasks in there that you need to do for every bid, every RFQ response, which are repetitive, which are not, don't necessarily require intelligence? And do those processes, doing them better, does it make a big impact on your bottom line, right? And clearly, having the coordination and the organization around the response to a new bid seems to be a crucial ingredient. And we've seen statistics about how there is good bid response teams and poor response teams, 10 to 15% difference in performance, and that is directly impacting your sales pipeline. So I think it's huge. And one of the things that we do is, from a technology point of view, is pair ourselves with the business stakeholders. Because each business runs those processes slightly differently. So really try to understand how you do that, how we can do that. And you're sort of bringing in that expertise, and we bring in the expertise of AI to see which of those processes can be automated best for an impact on bottom line. So that's how we want to think about it from a technology point of view as well. It's not automating arbitrary processes, but these specific ones which can directly be correlated to, revenue generation, for example.
This is very refreshing, and this stood out to me from the first conversation I had with you, ever since, this was when we were even kind of forming Orcaworks. And what really stood out is how you had this innate ability to actually look into what the problem statement is. Technology is always an enabler to solve that right problem statement. If technology is not driving ROI, in this case, what we're talking about here is really if we can make these industries more successful at the bid process, and even a very small increase of success in that is going to vastly increase their ROI. And to be able to actually think through that business lens and to be able to actually identify that pain point, which I think is fairly prevalent across these industries, and to really solve it using agentic AI. And for the sake of for the viewers, I want to kind of take this back home, right? He said something brilliant, and I kind of want to reiterate it at this point. It's really looking at those micro workflows or workflows within your larger SaaS systems or your existing processes to drive ROI out. That's really where agentic AI is playing, and that's the direction Orcaworks is taking. Brilliant. Thanks for those thoughts, Abhinav. I come from a very strong financial fintech background. Governance for me is it's non-negotiable per se. But ever since talking to you keep chiming this into both business and engineering minds. I've heard you say this over and over. Governance is non-negotiable. It should be at the crux and the core of platform. How are you thinking through this problem statement, especially at Orcaworks?
I'll paint a hypothetical situation for you, and I'll ask you a question, right?
Yeah.
Imagine you're a construction company and you started putting agents into your bidding process, right? So you'd have one agent which maybe reads your RFQ and figures out, hey, these are all the sort of subsystems and subcontracts I need to set up. You have a second agent that might actually go and talk to all your suppliers and get quotes from your suppliers. And a third agent that says, okay, fine, these are all my quotes. Let me pick the best ones. I put that together. And then finally, you have a bidding agent that sort of puts a response together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd estimate a quote for the RFQ itself. And then your bid manager uses all these agents. Wow, it's good. His work is, or her work is a lot easier. And then you put the estimate back in, and then you've underquoted.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, whose fault is it?
I would lay it straight on data. Probably whatever data I got, probably the estimator gave me the wrong data at that point. I'm gonna choke that single. If I was a business owner, I'm going after my estimator.
Right, you're going after the estimator. But the thing is, now you have your IT team, you have your agents, which we know that are making mistakes. We are aware that, agents are prone to making mistakes sometimes. You have your bid estimator itself who's to use the system in a certain way. So unless you have proper governance and thought put into governance up front, it is very, very difficult to understand and pinpoint where things go wrong. And therefore, before you deploy your agents, and we are going to get into a stage where every single process is going to be automated by some kind of agent, right? You have an augmented human agent setup. I don't know exactly how it's going to look, but that's going to happen. So unless you plan from day one as to how you're going to govern all your agents and your people and how they work together, it is going to be very messy very soon. So that's why we believe that, having a foresight about how you want to govern your agents is very important before you move from, let's say, your proof of concepts and your demos to real, production environments.
Interesting. I want to double click that a little bit and see if we can go further. So you're giving governance a very interesting angle. It's just not about who accesses what or which data accesses what. It's a little bit more than that. You're basically talking about governance from the perspective of how do I see where did the whole ecosystem go wrong if the final outcome is wrong. Can you dive into that a little bit more? At least want to get a sense of thought process. How do you put all this together? Do you see, again, I'm just thinking out very loud here. Do you have a set of dashboards which you kind of monitor? If that's the case, what kind of dashboards are those? I would love to hear a few more thoughts on that.
That's a lot to unpack there, right? I think it's a tricky process to unpack. I would like to think of it in terms of an analogy, right? I mean, I think we did a big transition from, how we used to have these data centers which were managed by our IT team with spaghetti scripts all over the place to how, let's say, AWS and modern cloud infrastructure gets managed today, right? Where we have essentially, instead of the entire architecture being sort of specified in hidden knowledge within IT teams, it's sort of specified in configuration, and we sort of figure out how our entire infrastructure is set up in a reliable way. And we won't somehow be able to say exactly which agent is running where and doing what in a way where we understand without actually dive deep into the code bases themselves. So a business user should be able to just come and say, hey, this is what my agents are doing, right? So there's two parts to it. One part is how that is set up and deployed in your infrastructure. And the second part is how do you provide visibility to the end user? And this is where the dashboards come in the picture. But before the dashboards come in the picture, you want to have solutions in place that allow you to deploy all your agents in your infrastructure, working along with people in a configurable manner. So that's where a lot of the engineering effort happens, and then ultimately the visibility comes through in the dashboards.
That was a very interesting perspective. In the industry, in enterprise, so many people talk about AI and these AI projects, and half the time we talk about how they are crazily unsuccessful.
Yeah.
I think there was a report out there, or there was a study out there which shows how 95% of the projects in AI just didn't go anywhere, just went south. We at Orcaworks always talk about pragmatic AI. We talk about how we are here to actually solve that cold start problem, which enterprises are solving.
Yeah.
What is it all about? What makes AI successful? What is that secret sauce according to you?
I wish I knew, right? I wish I knew the secret sauce. No, let me put my thoughts out there. Firstly, I think, when we say that there was unsuccessful projects, I think one of the issues is, we're talking about a transformational change, right? Yeah. We're all learning as to how best to set it up, right? I think that's one thing that we should caveat with, because this is going to take time. It's only been a couple of years since LLMs have become smart enough to do a few things. But now, in terms of our learnings, I think the most fundamental thing is what we just alluded to in the previous context, which is governance. Understanding governance and ROI, I think pair them together, right? So one thing is, before you decide where you want to deploy your agents, I think the most critical question is to understand which processes impact your bottom line most and can be automated reasonably easily, right? And there's an intersection of those processes. And I think it's very important to identify those areas. And this is really a discussion between your business stakeholder and your technologist to work together to identify processes that are automatable well, and at the same time provide you the right bottom line returns that you want. And it's a business stakeholder who you probably is the best at performing a certain function, right? You sit with that person and work with them consistently to understand what is the processes that they're doing really well that helps you improve ROI. And then pair this with the good technologies to identify those processes well, I think would be the key for me for starting. And at the same time, have your governance framework in place so that you're able to continuously automate those. And the moment you do the first one, right, you need to have your data foundations done well to enable that process to happen. And then your next workflow that you try to automate would be the next one, which is a bit easier because your data foundation is already in place for the first one to happen. And then you progressively go from there. So pairing up the governance along with the data foundation and this conversation between the correct business stakeholder and technologist, to summarize, I think would be critical to help this happen better.
Going back to the sense of governance and really have that conversation between the technologists. And, this analogy that you gave me probably a few months back really stuck out. I'm sure for all the technologists out there, it's going to hopefully stand out and it's going to remain in the mind like it did for me. We were chatting up about exactly this, and you said something brilliant, right? It's almost like if I were to draw an analogy, and this is for the technologists out there, it's almost like you're basically designing your APIs without really you're putting together your data model. And I think one thing that you've done brilliantly, and I think one thing we always talk at Orcaworks, which is given a problem statement, given we have these right stakeholder interviews, it's always about designing that right workflow with the context that we build along with. I just love how passionate you are about it. And we talk about it at Orcaworks all the time, right? To make one recipe for actually creating a successful agentic AI is to really know your data as well, and to really know the context and the knowledge base on top of the data, which we always talk about. And you hit on something like so important in many ways, like the way you talk about governance. Enterprise AI or even governed AI is not about getting one workflow successful. It's really about being able to scale from that one workflow to your 100th workflow. And I think your brilliance just shown through when you actually called it, what did you call it? You called it the IAC for agents, and how we actually drive it through the manifest. So thanks for those thoughts. Very, very helpful. I hope you all enjoyed this particular segment of the Data Shift podcast. With that said, we are actually moving on to our next section or segment, which is all about strategy. So stay tuned for that. And here goes the first question. It's very in line with something that we have actually spoken in the last section or segment. When anyone talks about AI, it's actually relevant to the first question that I asked. I would like for you to double click a little bit more into it. Content generation is great, but we here at Orcaworks always kind of emphasize agentic AI is a bit more or a lot more than just content generation. I would love to hear about your thoughts on how are sub workflows designed? I know you spoke a little bit about the stakeholder interviews. How are you drawing ROI through these workflows?
Let's take an example, right? I think let's stick to the RFQ bidding example, right?
Sure.
So I think normally, we sort of did some research on this topic, and your bidding teams, depending on the size of your company, and vary quite a bit. But let's say you typically think of like a 10-member bidding team, right?
Yeah.
So on average, you'd have like a couple of people who are sort of really responsible for estimates, a couple of people who put together the package. You'd have reporting lines, project management, just like, your estimation process that's also managed through project managers. So you have various roles in the system, and each of them is sort of doing their own little process. So the first step is to understand from a business process point of view exactly what is happening in your company, right? And each company has got a slightly different process. And therefore, when you employ a new employee to come into the system, they take some time to understand what the different team members' roles are within this process, right? And in a way, agents are a bit different from traditional software, where this understanding was not required. You just get a SaaS solution for a vertical saying, hey, here is a SaaS product for managing bids. But in the case of agents, it's not that easy to just drop in an agent in an existing workflow, because they're sort of augmenting what human beings are doing in the process, right? So one of the things that we do is we set up engineers who sort of can work very closely with the business leaders to understand their business process. And the technology that we built internally is an ability to translate that from this abstract concept of I'm doing bid estimation to exactly how does it convert to software that we can run in the field. And that needs to happen in a way where, we talked about this infrastructure as code concept, right? So we use a concept called agents as code to take this abstract process and map it into actual physical agents that run, but they run like a new employee that's in your team, as opposed to a piece of software that you use with your team. So that discussion is, I think, very, very important when you're trying to sort of embed agents, thing. And then it won't be one process, because, you don't want to be a situation where you automate step 1 and you can't automate steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, because people are doing so many different things. So how do you do that, and how do you scale that out is, I think, the technological challenge that we help to solve.
That's pretty interesting. And the way you basically described how micro workflows or sub workflows can actually be the thought process here is to really, how can it be enabled on agentic AI? And this is really leading into my second question. Now, you've touched on technology, right? For verticals like architecture, engineering, and construction, it's the hit rates, or however we improve performance, might be small. They might look small on percentage basis, but it's really, what's your thought process now? Put your business hat on. And then what's your thought process? How do these small hit rates really contribute towards larger margins or larger wins? What's the whole business sense there?
Yeah, I think any construction leader will know, right? They're working in very low margin businesses normally. So this is not news, right? So optimizing processes is super critical, and particularly in low margin businesses, right? It's like which are these ones. So the idea is, again, I think the business stakeholders would understand these processes much better, and it's sort of in a way for us at Orcaworks, at least, it's an open discussion as to which are the primary ones. But obviously, tender response rates, just improving the response rates where you have successful or unsuccessful applications to tenders would obviously have a huge impact on your bottom lines. The second thing is rework rates, things like missed opportunities as to communicating between your bid response teams and the eventual implementation teams, where that has not been done clearly, is also another place where there's clear gains that are possible. These are, but I would say, industry standards, right? And I think one of the things that we want to really do at Orcaworks is, every company is a bit different. Every business is a bit different. So specific workflows which have the biggest impact probably really depends on the business itself. But the idea is, think of your best employee, and if you can replicate that workflow well, we want to help agents sort of augment your best employees so that they can repetitively do those tasks. I think the message that we want to convey is, we want to first identify those. And then, in low margin businesses, just improving small margins there would make a big impact on your bottom line.
This is interesting, and we talk about it all the time at Orcaworks, and we say this like in the sense like ROI can be driven in one of two ways. Like we talk about it all the time, through efficiency or through the core revenue model itself, like driving. And here by actually driving to the core workflows, it could be the bidding systems, making them more efficient. It could be the RFP processes that they're actually putting against. I think all of them, to your point, are actually driving those. It could be small percentage increments, but yeah, for low margin businesses, even a small percentage margin is going to accumulate towards that bottom line very quickly. Brilliant thought. And again, I just wanted to kind of quickly reiterate for the sake of the audience, right? So the way we look at here at Orcaworks is it's all about drawing ROI into your business. It could be your small, medium business that you're running. And right now we are specifically talking about your architecture, engineering, and your construction businesses, right? You have these operations, you got these mundane operations, which your employees are actually running through every day. Now look at basically agentifying these so that you can actually draw efficiencies out of it. Operations efficiencies in these industries go a long way. At the same time, you also look at your core workflows on your revenue, your core workflow, and then you could actually help run that. Actually, there's a very interesting example coming up in my mind, so I'll share. Here at Orcaworks, we are helping nonprofits gain revenues on their core revenue model. You know how? By actually creating agents to help them on grant recommendation. Just want to put it out there. So you think of a business model, you think of a vertical, there's ways to drive ROI. Great answer, Abhinav. With that said, I would like for us to touch on a couple things, and I'm just, I think you might have answered this in many ways, but I want to kind of pick it up. Let's say I'm an AEC, I'm an architecture, engineering, and construction firm owner. In your mind, what do you think is that low-hanging fruit that they can go after? If there is one workflow that you would like to see automated, and to make it a little bit more interesting, I'm going to keep the bid away for a minute. Yeah. And can you, like, we've been talking about bid all through the podcast. What would be one other thing that you would think about?
I think visibility, workflows around visibility is probably very crucial. So that's probably where I would start anyways, right? So in the sense that you have different teams doing different things. Imagine a business leader who wants to understand where all my bids are and where all my delivery is. And you would have agents which are specifically designed to answer those questions for your business leaders and pull that data out into an easily digestible dashboard. I think that would actually make a big impact, maybe indirectly, because you get much, much better visibility into what your business is doing today. It's probably where I would focus on right now.
Interesting. Thanks for the thought. Phenomenal. The next question is something that I'm kind of opinionated and passionate because of my background, but I'm going to put it out to you. And, there's always this conversation about speed versus auditability, like speed versus doing it right. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that? Like in the Agentic AI world, and I know why you're smiling like that. I'm really curious on this answer, if you're going to stay true to yourself. So I would love to get your thoughts on what is speed versus auditability. Where do you stand on that conversation?
I think we should say governance. Yeah. But my gut tells me speed is very important as well, right? So in a way, it's a bit weird. I don't think we want to over-index on either. So normally how I would think of it is speed to delivery is crucial, right? I think that's the most important one because because there's so many changes, right? And you're not running in an ideal world. And when you're actually a business leader that wants to invest in a new technology, you want to be able to see returns on investment as quickly as possible. So I would say speed is more important than governance in some ways, but speed without any thought about governance is probably where I would draw the line, right? So you want to understand how you want to eventually govern your system, but focus on delivery quickly.
I am not surprised that you actually said that. Right. And for a minute, that was more like a test. Are you going to stay true to yourself? I'm going to give politically the right answer here, okay? Governance is always important. Start with governance, and that's why it's governed AI. Like, I'll shut up and be a little bit more realistic about it. But, what I mean by that is, I guess the space that I'm coming from, especially coming from at least things that I've learned in the past and whatever, I am as passionate about building products, about it. Yes. And one thing that I have to kind of attest and kind of share here, right? The pace at which you actually build the platform, that just shows to itself. And the pace at which we have been building products at Charter Global, maybe Assessly, maybe Orcaworks, kind of stands a testament to the pace at which we're building it. So completely sold on that aspect. But something that I've actually learned through my days at the enterprise, often we mistake governance or even moving compliance and security to the left as more a hurdle. Rather, I feel like moving that to the left and having that baked in, which is your thought process on the whole platform, actually expedites the delivery in many ways. We've seen that, all of these regulated industries, we have to be SOC 1, SOC 2 compliant, and that's never an afterthought, especially on platforms like Orcaworks. But I have to applaud you here. Thanks for staying true to yourself and like really saying how speed is more for you than governance. With that said, I am actually we've actually covered all of the questions in this segment. I was brilliant. Do you want to double click on anything? I almost feel like there's something that you want to share more, Abhinav.
I think the speed was governance question. I want to double click on that a bit more, right? I think speed at the cost of governance is not something that you ever want to pay. Right. Understand exactly where your control points are and why those are important for you, and have enough thought put into that so that you never give that up. But it doesn't never necessarily have to ever be a bottleneck for speed of delivery. Right? I think if you plan it out well, I think that's definitely feasible. So that's why I find that question a bit. I don't want to over-index on either option.
Fair point. Yeah. No, fair point. I think that's true pretty well. All right. That was the end of our strategy segment. I hope you all enjoyed it. With that said, we're actually going to move to our pro segment. We're going to chat up about a few of pro questions, and you can double click as much as you want. And we get this segment is really geared towards all those technology enthusiasts out there. Let's start with something you've been touching on the business ROI so much. I would love for you to touch this more or talk about this more from an technology perspective. Your thought process on architecting these Microsoft workflows. What's the thought process on architecting? I would love for you to talk about it both from a context perspective and also from the flow perspective itself. And how do you evaluate stack on this? How do you really evaluate architecture on this and stuff like that?
All right, just like that's a lot to unpack, right? Do we have an hour? The producer says no. I think there's a few different things that are top of mind, right? I think, firstly, your data is obviously foundational. I think that's generally the case, anyways. But in this particular case, I think traditionally we used to deal with a lot of structured, semi-structured data. Yeah. But now we have to deal with a lot of unstructured data that's sort of hidden in your emails, maybe in your SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams chats. There's so much information all over the place. And that needs to be somehow contextualized in a way with the AI and AI agents can consume it, right? And then you want to do this in a way where, your access control rights are baked into how this is being done. So you can't actually take somebody's Teams chat and make it available to an agent that is going to work for somebody else. So there needs to be, when you're setting up your data pipelines, you need to understand upfront how this structured data and unstructured data needs to be saved. And because it's no longer structured all the time, it's very difficult to understand who has access to what information. So having that pipeline done really well, you need to have a full framework that sets that up well for you. And the second one, which is actually in a way a lot more subtle, is very unique to this space, is agents are now almost like humans in some ways. They can understand a lot more nuanced information. They can understand language. They can understand text and produce outputs based on that, which means that you need to be able to tell them exactly what are the sequence of steps that would be optimal to solve a particular problem in your business process today. But any industry, you're not actually, just looking at bits, right? You're looking at bits, but you're also looking at HR, you're looking at project management, and each of them have their own vocabulary and their own way of doing things. So the framework that allows you to deploy these agents should allow you to deploy agents that work in different contexts and different processes. So how do you abstract out the workflows that your agents are executing in a way where you can deploy it across these multiple different parts of your business is critical, right? So the context and the data that you build out and the agents, and ultimately, we talked about touch and governance a couple of times. You want to be able to deploy this in a way where you know exactly what part of your system is doing what and change it and version it like we do for traditional software. So an agentic framework that does all these three different aspects for you is crucial. And maybe one last aspect that we want to touch on is in terms of change management. See, again, like going traditional software used to have SaaS solutions where a user would go to the software and start working with it. But agents can work with you. They can work with you in Teams. They can work with you in Outlook. So you need to bring the agents to the user as opposed to make them go to a new SaaS solution. So how do we actually bring that in well as well? And an agent framework that allows you to bring the agent to the user as opposed to take the user to a new SaaS application is also something that I would look for when I'm trying to build out like an agentic platform or a solution in that space.
That was interesting. Well, what you touched upon is, I think that where you're really drawing a very distinct, interesting line is how you basically bring agents to the users rather than actually having them at their own tool sets and learning a different set of tool sets and whatnot. That's your vision of actually running those micro workflows from where they are. And interesting aspect of what you touched on is how the agent, unlike and I want to repeat this for the sake of our audience, unlike traditional SaaS software, the problem statement here is agents can interact with you, which means they can keep track of the context that you are in and vice versa. So it's really about picking up those sub workflows at the context where you are in the workflow. That is very refreshing. That's very interesting, and that's very powerful. With that said, again, I'm going to get into something which really excited me when I first heard about this, right? I felt like we here at Orcaworks really have our moat because of this. It's our engineering innovation in many ways. Scaling enterprise AI, right? The whole aspect and thought process of manifest-driven scale, manifest-driven enterprise AI. Would love to hear about your thoughts on where did that come from? I would love to hear some battle scars and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think what you're alluding to is what I was doing in my previous job, which was, we were building a very specific solution to manage billing for hospitals, right? And we sort of went through the change where we're using, let's say, slightly more traditional machine learning, and started using GPT version 2 and 3, and then now the newer versions of the GPT models, right? I think the newer AI that we have available, and we went through a phase of about a couple of years where we continuously kept iterating as the technology kept improving, and we wrote so much spaghetti code that we did not know what was happening in our agentic part of our system. So we went back and said, hey, this is a mess. We need to figure out a better way of deploying it, and made an analogy to a problem that the industry has solved maybe 15 years back when we moved from, say, data centers to cloud. And the deployment that happens in the cloud is much more deterministic and much more well understood, as opposed to, the scripts that we used to use, 20 years back to bring up our network, bring up our firewalls, bring up our servers and all of that. So the question was, can we actually translate the same type of idea into how we deploy our agents in our enterprise solutions, right? And the problem was a little bit tricky because, essentially there, at least we always knew that we're dealing with servers and firewalls and network infrastructure, so we knew what we were deploying. But in this case, we didn't know. The agents could be working in so many different contexts, right? They could be working in the construction industry, and in the construction industry, we might have the bid process that we mentioned, but also HR. But the HR agent stays same across multiple verticals, right? So the construction HR person will be very similar to HR or Charter Global, for example. So the idea was how can we abstract out what agents do and how the context for agents is organized in a way where the same abstraction was done in the cloud. And is it possible? Is it feasible? So that's, I would say, in a way, the biggest innovation that we did at Orcaworks, which is have a declarative way in which you specify, this is how I'm going to manage my data. This is how I'm going to manage my context. This is how I'm going to manage my agents, and this is how I'm going to bring the agents to the user. All of that can be declaratively specified, which is what brings our governance in as well, right? So we want, as we mentioned earlier, the governance and speed question. The platform provides you governance of what is deployed where and when and how. And then once you can do that for individual verticals, we're able to very quickly bring out solutions for them. I think that was probably the key innovation that we did at Orcaworks as well, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was brilliant to be able to actually draw the analogy of IAC for infrastructure as code towards what the agents would do and how they would actually scale at that point. And at that point, it's not about basically what you call a spaghetti of code. It's not really building code after code, but really scaling it up. No, yeah. Perfect, makes sense. Whenever we talk about agentic AI, this conversation has to happen. Like in the sense, like, what's your thoughts on hallucination? What's your thoughts on like how can you ensure that the agents and the agentic workflows really deliver what they promise? How do we put those guardrails? How do we really ensure that happens? Would love to also pick your brains on in the sense of like from a whole RAG ML modeling perspective as well. How is all that situated at Orcaworks?
I'll give you the bad news first.
Yeah.
At least as far as I know, there is no technology that I'm aware of today that gets sort of hallucinations for us, right? I mean, that is a part and parcel of how LLMs work today. So there are a lot of things that that is being done. There's a lot of that research that is being done to make that situation better. But I don't see anything that is happening right now that fundamentally gets rid of that problem, right? So the question, but also it's completely clear that it brings us a lot of benefits. So the question is, given what we have, what can we do, and how can we use it? And I think this is fundamentally where we sort of bring in context. So the better your agents understand your context, and the closer the agents are to understanding context, the less likely it is that they hallucinate and make up stories, right? Essentially, that's what we talk about when we talk about hallucinations. So better grounding in context is super important. I think that's well understood. And the second thing, which is probably maybe a little bit less understood, is it is not about one call to a big ChatGPT type model, right? So if you break it up into smaller calls, which the large language model can answer more reliably, and this is where we have engineers do that well for you, then we're much more likely to make that a reliable answer, because you're not asking a very complicated question for which it does not have an answer and has to make up an answer. So having the chain of thought to allow the LLM to answer better and bring in the context to the LLM is very, very important. I think that's the main thing. And then also understanding which workflows, where is it critical to make sure that it actually works reliably. And in those cases, you bring the human into the loop and design the UX, the user experience really well, so that the mistakes get caught for critical workflows. I think is also very important. And this is where bringing the agent into workflows as opposed to the other way around, I think is one of the things that we think about as well all the time.
And I want to share add to it and share a little bit more about how we think about it at Orcaworks all the time, and how it's beautifully integrated into the whole problem statement itself. We keep talking about these two sets of engineers per se at Orcaworks. We keep talking about how flow architects and context engineers. It's a little bit more than technology, like you rightly said, right? It's really those right stakeholder interviews. It's really identifying those sub workflows and designing that workflow and the context which is needed for the workflow as closely as you can to solve the problem statement, which is going to keep the agent on the spot. That's really what we're taking home. But I would like to draw the attention of the audience back to this, right? It's how it's all really interrelated, integrated in many ways than one, right? So like what we're talking about here is bringing in the right ROI to the business, which comes, and from that we actually go to stakeholder interviews, and the interviews translate into what we call as our service segment, which is our flow architects and context architects really drawing that problem statement well and having the agentic workflow perform well. And I've heard this, I've heard Abhinav say this over and over again, and we do this at Orcaworks. You always inspect what you expect in many ways. So you have your dashboarding available from day one. You have your eval services per agents actually built in and baked into the process, so that it's not an afterthought. And that way, you're already kind of inspecting what you're expecting. You're looking at those dashboards, you're looking at those evaluation services, and you're seeing if this is measurable in any way possible. Thanks for that, and I think it was brilliant the way you actually answered that. Moving on to the next question, again, you can tell me if this is close to your heart or this is something you want to touch on or not. RPA versus agentic AI, like where do you see RPA breaking? Especially coming from Charter Global, they were heavy into RPA. And when I took the reins of Charter Global, I said, you know what, let's put a break to this and let's start agentic AI world. I was very clear in my mind why I was doing that, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think they're very closely related, right? I mean, I think agents would clearly going to impact so many different areas of our industry and how enterprise software is done. And RPA is very susceptible to change. I think one of the good things that RPA brings to the table is, process automation already understands how to govern these processes well. Traditionally, RPA used to be situations where you had a specific set of inputs and a specific set of steps that you should take and a specific set of outputs that come through. And agentic AI allows you to be much more interpretive of the inputs, right? So now you have a long piece of text that can come as one of the inputs into your process, and you know how to process those steps well. I think that they mesh really well. There are specific parts of the RPA process that agentic AI would help with. So I don't see them as distinct fields, but I see them as, complementary areas that work very well together. Only thing is, I guess one of the issues is, a traditional RPA firm probably has a lot of legacy issues to deal with. Whereas from a purely technological point of view, it's probably easier to solve a lot of problems where you don't necessarily have to deal with that legacy. But that's a technical sort of issue more than anything else. But I do see the two frameworks as being very complementary.
As you're speaking about it, something interesting was happening in my mind. Let me put it out there and see if you shoot it down or not, right? Could you look at RPA as part of the tooling for your agentic workflow? Like it could potentially be part of the tooling for your agentic workflow where it does some things very well. Yeah. It does scripting, anything which is static, anything which is good. So could you look at it as part of the tooling stack itself, and that's how they complement each other?
Yeah, I like shooting it down, but I think I have to agree. So yeah, exactly. I think that's how I see it, complementary, right? I mean, traditional RPA would do the scripting part of things, and agentic would be the much more nuanced understanding what the user wants and understanding text better. And producing certain outputs, which maybe traditional RPA could not historically do, is exactly right. Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. All right. A few times I give the option to shoot me down, but that's fine. With that said, for all those business owners, for all those executives who are on the fence, is this AI agentic overhype? Do I just wait on the fence, and do I watch and wait and really see where this is going? What are they losing? If let's say they're in that mode for the next 2 to 3 years, what are they really losing? What do you think? Is there a change in the bottom lines of the ROI? How do you look at that?
I mean, it's not a question of if, right? It's a question of when. I think every single business is going to use agents. We just don't know how yet. But that change is happening. The question is, when is the right time to make the change? I think that's probably the right question. And I mean, obviously, we at Orcaworks believe that we're ready for that, right? We already almost, when things are changing so fast, we almost went through the peak of the hype cycle where, hey, this is awesome. Hey, I don't think this works. And now the real applications are going to come out. And really, I think it is critical to understand maybe not your entire set of workflows. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But the most critical ones, which have the biggest impact on your bottom line, if you're not already thinking consciously as to how you can automate that and how you can improve your revenue from agents, then it's already too late.
That's very interesting, and that's in line with what I'm hearing from the market too. For all the audience here, the more we chat up with all these business owners across, and at Orcaworks, I have this really amazing opportunities to chat up with a lot of these business technology owners across a lot of industries, and I'm hearing this message very clearly. They all thought that the inflection point was 6 months down the lane or 1 year down the lane, and they realize the inflection point is here right now. People who are actually making the change and who are actually moving forward with the change and looking at agentic AI workflows to actually bring in that ROI into the business are moving heavily in that direction. Thanks for those candid conversations. And with that said, one last question for this segment. For all those CTOs out there, all those technology leaders out there, you might have spoken to a few of them, and please don't put me in that bucket. What would be the biggest misconception that these leaders have about agentic AI?
I think that the people don't necessarily understand the difference between the difficulty there is to go from a demo / proof of concept, because it looks beautiful, it seems to work well, to a repeatable automation of a specific workflow within your vertical. I think the gap between those two is still not very well understood, right? And the gap is not necessarily because it's just too hard. It is probably because the governance has not been thought through well enough, and the data has not been thought through well enough. And if those things are done, then the gap is maybe not necessarily very big to go from a proof of concept to a real implementation. But just starting off with a demo to going to a real implementation without having the framework in place is still quite high, and people don't realize how big that gap is.
No, you have. Thanks for that answer. That was right on the money. And I've seen this over and over again. The last few years at Equifax, AI in the agentic world was always played in as a POC. They would bring in, they would do these amazing things, and then the thought process was not there. We remember these days when we brought in those POCs with LangChain, LangGraph, and then we would actually play on top of it, would actually build on top of it. And then soon to realize that, oh my God, this is not enterprise-wide available or adaptable. That's an interesting thought to close that segment. That was powerful. That was helpful. Thanks for answering all those questions on the pro round, Abhinav. I hope all you technologists out there people who are on the fence to see if agentic AI is real or not. Now was really the time. Jump in and really reap the benefits. Definitely come check with us, talk to us what we are doing at Orcaworks and how we are actually solving these problem statements for all of you. With that said, I'm actually going to jump into my most favorite round, the faster one, the rapid fire one. Are you ready for some snippy questions? We're going to go to about 10 questions now, Abhinav.
Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Here's the first one. Let's keep it short. Let's keep it fast. Have you ever used AI and not told anyone?
Every time. I've done it so many times. Yes, of course.
I got an interview there. He is the most honest person I've met. And if not anything, at Orcaworks, he has actually taught us how to use AI better. So I had to put in there. Most overhyped AI term today?
Agentic.
All right. Okay. We talked about this. Governance or speed, which breaks companies more often?
Which breaks companies more often? Speed.
There you go. Okay. First workflow every construction firm should automate.
Bid management.
You did. Yeah.
Said that. Yes.
If AI disappeared tomorrow, what part of your life would collapse first?
Oh my God. My diet control.
That is interesting. Biggest technical mistake when building agents?
Yeah, as I said, not having a framework in place to go from demos to real production code. Absolutely.
Makes sense.
So, yeah.
One KPI your architecture, engineering, and construction leaders should track according to you.
Hit rates. How often do you put a bid and you are not successful? That rate is, I think, crucial.
Okay. Human in the loop, essential or overrated?
Essential.
This is an interesting one. I'm really curious about your take, and I'm going to let my daughter know. Just listen to this answer. If a 15-year-old asked you what to study today for 2035, what would you say?
Anything that needs you to talk to the other people on the other side. So I think the sales guys will be fine, or the sales girls. I think doctors will still be okay. Nurses probably still be okay. Don't do software engineering.
Oh wow. Not even agentic AI, ML engineering, an engineer at heart.
I didn't say don't do engineering. Software engineering? No, I don't think so. Don't write code anymore.
All right, brilliant. It's now your turn to go. Give me a question you'd like to ask me.
What would you do if you had an agent that helped you meditate?
What would I do if I had an agent to meditate? That's a very interesting question. The whole aspect of meditation is to really cut loose from everything outside. It's something which is inside, and I've been meditating for about 15 years, and I enjoy meditating. I would utilize it, absolutely. I would utilize it if I have an agent to help me meditate, and probably like if it spreads meditation across the globe, and why not? I'll be very passionately spreading that, marketing that agent. Absolutely.
I thought you would.
No, thanks for ending the conversation on that lighter note. But this was a really powerful conversation. Thanks for really breaking down some of these really interesting conversations. And Abhinav, what really sets you apart is just not the technologies, the very ardent innovator hat that you wear. You always look at solving business problems and how effectively you solve it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Data Shift. Stay tuned for the next one. Till then, stay curious, stay data-driven, and let's keep learning. All right, if this conversation has resonated with you, especially the architecture, engineering, and construction business owners, definitely reach out to us here at Orcaworks. You can reach us out through our website, which is www.orcaworks.ai. You can always see the website information and our contact details in the pinned comments down. Thank you.